Welcome back to another episode of A Gift from Adversity. My name is Juri Love. I'm your host. Today we are recording episode 106. Before I introduce our guest tonight, I want to introduce myself and my book. My name is Juri, Juri Love, and my book is the same title as this podcast. It's called A Gift from Adversity. The subtitle of this book is Overcoming Sexual Abuse, Domestic Violence, Bullying, and Homelessness, and it's available on Amazon. When I published this book in 2020, I got a lot of messages from all over the world of sharing their adversities, and I felt very compelled last year to start a podcast where people can talk about the adversity, but not only their stories, but also the tools that they use to overcome, and then the gift that came from it. And I'm very, very grateful to have so many people, over 100 guests so far from all over the world, sharing not only their stories of the adversity, but the tools that we definitely need in this society. So thank you so much again for tuning in, and let's invite our guest. Today we have a guest from Vancouver, Canada. Hi, Suzanne. Thank you so much for coming into a Gift from Adversity podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Juri. I just love the theme of your podcast. It's so important, that we share the things that have happened to us, the adversities we've faced. And then I love the focus on the tools. Like if we all shared how we overcame these things and what we learned, that's world changing. So I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So before we go into our first question, would you please introduce your name, where you're coming in from, and then what you do, and if you have any social media or website that you want to promote?
Yes, of course. I'm Suzanne Jabour, and I'm in Vancouver, Canada. So just north of Seattle. For people that know the States, I'm just north of Seattle. And I am a grief educator. You can find out all about the services and workshops that I offer on my website. That's the best place to find me, which is alivedexperience.com. And there's links there to all the socials. So it's easiest to start there and then branch out. You can sign up for the newsletter, book an appointment. All the things are on the website. So that's a great place to start.
And what is your website about?
So on the website, I really have focused on sharing my grief journey and what I'm learning, because I'm with you. I'm all about sharing the tools. So what have I discovered? What am I experiencing? And then I also have a series of workshops, and I work with businesses to make sure that their workplace is grief literate. So that's really become what I'm doing to try and create a bigger shift around grief and open up the paradigm we're in now.
So website again?
alivedexperience.com.
So people please visit livedexperience.com.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So, Suzanne, let's dive into our first question, which is the adversity. So, can you tell our audience what was your adversity?
So I think most of us have lived lives with many adversities, but the one that has changed my life the most and is the most recent was the death of my 22-year-old son in September of 2020. And I think most of us can kind of imagine what it might be like to lose a child. I will say that it is as devastating, as discombobulating, as disorienting, as you might imagine. I really felt shattered. Like I could see myself as those big sort of 3D puzzle pieces on the ground, like pieces of myself and my life. And my arms were already full of pieces that I didn't know how to put back together. And I also could see all of these pieces that I had to make a decision about what I carried with me and what I just left behind. So that was really, the most disorienting part was just sort of this sense that who I was does, my son is no longer here and who I was doesn't exist either. And so then what? And you're just trying to get through every day which is impossible. My life feels like a post-apocalyptic nightmare, and the rest of the world is just carrying on, which feels really disorienting and isolating. And it's all you can do. I mean, I look back at the step counts, and we kind of find, touchstones to measure our life. And I look back at the step counts from those days, and I would take like 200 or 500. And that would be literally like I can make it from the bed to the couch, maybe to the kitchen once to like make toast, and to the bathroom, and then like back to bed. And that was it. Because really, you're just in survival mode. Everything is exploded. And unfortunately, with grief, the way that it works now in Western culture anyway, is most of us are completely grief illiterate and phobic and fearful. And so it's really hard for people to support you. And I was a grieving mom, grieving out loud. I'm sure to many I was very scary, right? I was a little bit terrifying because I had big emotions all the time, and I knew I just had to share them. And that really was, unfathomable. It's like your brain is trying to make sense of the nonsensical, and the cognitive dissonance is so big because there's just nothing that makes sense anymore when something like that has happened.
How many children do you have?
I have two. So Ben, who died in 2020, and I have a daughter as well, his older sister.
May I ask how he had passed?
Yeah, I choose to say that Ben died of depression and anxiety. For most deaths, we identify the underlying cause, and that was the underlying cause of his death.
So he was 22 years old?
Yes. Yeah.
So this was last year.
2020. So two and 3/4 years ago. Yeah, it'll be 3 years this coming September.
Okay, 2020. So it has been 3 years.
Yeah,
Almost
two
three.
and a half years. Yeah, almost three. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I think as a mother myself, and I have two kids, I'm a single mom of two. I don't even want to think about it. And a lot of people say it's the worst feeling as a parent to lose a child instead of a child losing the parents, which is kind of normal.
Yeah.
So how was your feeling when this happened? Like disbelief, disconnect?
Yep. And what's so interesting about especially those acute, very early days is it's a tsunami of feelings, right? It's just overwhelming. You feel like you're spinning around under the water and you can't get a breath. It's disconcerting, like you just feel confused, and everything that used to be easy is now hard. Like for me, like my muscle memory didn't work anymore. So like things that you would do out of routine that you not even think about, I couldn't remember how to do those kinds of things. Like having a shower, for example, became this like 25-minute ordeal because I'd have to think. We don't think when we're in the shower. I think that's why we have such great ideas there, because our brain can think about amazing, incredible things because we know how to shower ourselves, right? But I would stand in the shower and think, oh, I'm in the shower. Okay, so what do I do here? Oh, I wash myself. Okay, so have I shampooed my hair? Like I couldn't remember if I had shampooed already and I was on conditioner, or if I still needed to shampoo. And then it's like, okay, and then I have to wash myself. So, and I'd have to think through, like, let's make sure we get all the bits and bobs, right? It was so disorienting. And, my daughter described it, she has the best succinctness about her. She described it as all the emotions all the time. And that's what it feels like. And I think for most of us, what's the most uncomfortable about it is we've been taught to not feel all the bad emotions, right? We're not supposed to feel angry and frustrated and devastated and sad and demoralized and confused and all of those kind of, if you think about positive emotions and negative emotions, which I personally think is such a harmful paradigm because emotions just are emotions and we need to learn how to process all of them. But you're overwhelmed with emotions that are all from the list that you've been taught your whole life are not sort of socially acceptable. So then what are you supposed to do? Right? Then like you can't, and for me, I completely lost the ability to pretend anything. We all have that ability to kind of put on a mask and be pleasant and, present ourselves in a way that's socially acceptable. And my ability to do that completely left. So any kind of ability to sort of perform and be like good, like that had all gone out the window. So it really was that sense of, cumulative losses, right? So my son has died. I've lost myself too. I don't know who I am anymore because I can't do normal things. And, we're basically, you don't have a ton of support because people are so scared and they don't want to do the wrong thing, right? So they end up not doing anything. And this is also happening all in the midst of COVID restrictions and lockdowns and all of that, which in the end, in a weird way, ended up being a gift. We'll get to on question 3. But at the time, meant that we couldn't gather. We couldn't have a service. Ben didn't want one anyway, so I wouldn't have had one. But it made it very difficult for people to support us because, we were all in our little bubbles. And the job that I had at the time had really serious consequences. If I got sick, I had to take an extended period of unpaid leave. So I was being really cautious. So it just, compounds and compounds and compounds all those emotions. And, you know, I think we need to learn ways to allow them to be okay because we can't keep stuffing them. That's where we're at now, and it's a hot mess.
So would you mind to talk a little bit about Ben? So you kind of mentioned like depressed or depression. What happened to him? Like bullied or like any sort
Yep.
of
Yep.
signs?
So absolutely, yeah. So Ben was an astonishing human, and I know most parents think that about their child, and so I'm no different. He was wildly gifted. So in grade 4 here, they do or grade 3, they do a test to measure kids' giftedness to identify the gifted kids, and he scored in the 99th percentile. So basically, you can't score any higher than that. I describe how smart he was by saying he read Harry Potter in kindergarten. So he read the Harry Potter books in kindergarten. And the book he chose for himself as his summer reading book between grade 3 and grade 4 was Moby Dick. So he was incredibly smart, and a gifted mind actually works a different way than a bright typical person. Like I'm kind of a bright typical person. His mind worked a whole different way. And so, yeah, I think, the school system and peers in school are very unkind to kids who are different. And Ben was very different. So he was really severely bullied by students, staff, and administrators. He had administrators, principals and teachers say horrifying things to him. Um, and that all really and he knew he was different. So, it's really hard in a system that's designed for kind of the middle of the pack to be such an outlier. And he was fortunate along the way to have a few amazing teachers and, a few horrible teachers, and then a bunch that just kind of did what they could to support him. But there's not a lot of capacity in the system for individualized work. And there's not a lot of understanding of kids who are so far off kind of those normal measures. So absolutely, I think bullying was a factor for him. He had mental health challenges from when he was very young. And that's the pattern for sure, that it was, the trauma from being othered, from being bullied, from being picked on. And I think, as one of the gifts of his mind was he saw things really deeply and he could understand things in a way that allowed him to kind of see the big picture. So if you think about what was happening around the world that spring and summer of 2020, there was all kinds of unrest. George Floyd had been murdered, and so there were the protests coming out of that, and then the backlash against people standing up for human rights. And there was all kinds of issues with the Two-Spirit LGBTQ community. The world, environmentally, the world was literally on fire. There were wildfires and forest fires globally. And we were seeing inequity and injustice in ways that we hadn't before, which I think was a gift of the pandemic. We were all forced to slow down. We saw the world in a new way. And all of that weighed really heavily on him and was really hard for him to hold. Part of what happens with folks who have depression and anxiety is their brain gets into cycles, and it's really hard for them to break those cycles. So for Ben, he would get into a thought pattern about how terrible everything was. And it's really hard when your brain is wired that, when it chemically works that way, for you to break that cycle. So, I know that all those things weighed really heavily on them. And I think it ultimately was a factor um, in the timing of his death.
It's just so heartbreaking to hear, and it's just awful. And the school system and the bullying, I went through bullying, as I mentioned in
Mhm.
my book, my kids included. And not only just the bullying part of it, but the school that didn't like help, and then the
Mhm.
system that denies.
Yep.
That is just second and third shock waves that hurt so much more than initial bullying.
Yeah, because if you feel like this terrible thing has happened to you and the people who are supposed to be in charge minimize and dismiss it, then you also end up with that cognitive dissonance that I was talking about happens in grief, right? Because this thing happened to you. You know it in your body, you know it in your mind. And people who are supposed to know the system better than you claim that it either didn't happen, it wasn't as serious, they were just kidding. Like there's all these ways we dismiss it that, as you say, are so harmful to the people being impacted. And, I know teachers are doing the best they can. This is not a dig against teachers at all. And systemically, there's a big problem.
So I don't know about Canada, but in America, um, obviously, like a lot of racism and biases against minorities too. How is it in Vancouver?
Yeah, I think Canada has a racist history as well. We don't have slavery as part of that, but for sure we have racism problems here. Uh, Geared, where I live in Canada, there's not a lot of African Canadians or Black Canadians, but we have a huge population from Asia, and many of whom have been here as long as my family. So to me, they're just Canadians. But there's and then you get into the tangle of the model minority issues, right? Where there's this sense that there's a different set of expectations because you're supposed to be good at math and science and like all these horrible things that we, those biases and those racist ideas that we still carry, and that we're all swimming in this sea of racism. There, it's a systemic issue that we need to tackle together. That's part of it for sure. And I think Ben saw that and saw that, he so clearly understood that human rights are for everyone and that, Black lives matter because if we can take care of those lives, it means we're taking care of all of them, right? We can take care of the lives of the people who are being persecuted, then that means everyone's life is being cared for. Because as white Canadians, we don't need extra help, right? I'm just fine. Um, Ben was gay, so he felt really heavily a lot of the homophobic and transphobic things that were starting to happen, and it's just been a cascade of even worse and worse things happening since his death. But he felt that very heavily that he was, who he was in some parts of the world was illegal, and that's a heavy burden to carry as a young person. It's not here. Here he has, the same rights and marriage is legal, and but there's still that underlying phobia and that underlying um, conservatism, puritanicalism. I don't know what the foundation of it is. It's the fear of other that I think we just all need to get over because it's literally costing lives.
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing your story and the grief. I just want to ask you a question. So you mentioned that people didn't know what to tell you. You were um, in the middle of the grief and the pandemic too. That I have a friend who said after she lost her son, she lost her friends as well because people didn't know how to
Mhm.
say or what to say to her. And then people just stopped reaching out to her. And then
Mhm.
therefore she felt she just lost all our friends. Did it happen to you?
It did in a way. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about grief education is that there is this understanding, and what your friend went through is absolutely normal. The normal thing that happens is that grief changes your address book. And to me, that's just an additional grief on top of what you're already dealing with, right? That the people who you thought would show up for you and who were like your people that you would show up for no matter what don't show up. And I really think that it's because we have so much fear around grief. I know that's a huge part of it. If I do a workshop or a survey and I ask people why they didn't show up for someone, 99% of the time the answer is fear. And we have so much fear that we're going to do or say the wrong thing that we get all tangled up and we end up doing and saying nothing. And then time goes by and it gets more awkward to talk about. And then you've not said anything. And then really, I've had to really do a lot of soul searching about, the people who I thought were my inner circle who didn't show up. And I say this really with no blame or judgment. I understand why it's hard. And, I've done so much reading and research and learning since then to really kind of try to figure this out. So I understand why it's hard, but the reality is people don't show up for you. So I had to really do some soul searching about then, where do those people then fit in the life that I'm rebuilding for myself? Because, if you have the kind of relationship with someone where you think when the poop hits the fan, they'll show up for you and they don't, then what? Then you have to kind of make decisions about, well, how much energy does that person get? How much of my time does that person get? How much do I invest in that relationship? And I think for me, especially, and I think you probably find this as well, when you have kids, you make so many friends out of your kids. Like you meet the parents who are at dance class or soccer or wherever, or at school, and those become your friends too, the parents of your kids' friends. So for my closest group of friends, they all had kids the same age as mine. So this loss hit really, really close to them. And many of them have, kids who are gifted or kids who are part of the LGBTQ community or whatever it is, who had commonalities with the kids with mental health challenges. So like this hit really close to home for a lot of my friends. And I know that was really hard for them because one person told me. So I know when one person says something, they're speaking on behalf of, 10 or 100 or however many, right? So it was really difficult at the time to feel like we needed support and people who I thought would show up didn't. The beauty of it, though, is that some people did. And those people really now have become, my inner circle that I know in the worst of times will be there for me because I have lived the worst of times. So, it's a double-edged sword, as everything is, right? Everything is a both and. So, yes, some friends not as close as they were, some friends even closer, and some acquaintances now in that closest friend circle. So I think we have to give and ask for a lot of grace because as a collective, we're really terrible at navigating grief. We really don't understand it. We really don't know how to show up for each other. And it's opportunities like this where you have people come on and talk about like what was the adversity, what were the tools you used to rebuild after it. That's the kind of conversations we should all be having in our regular lives because that's where the richness of our human experience is, right? It's not in the perfect food picture or I went to this thing and what it's not there. It's in like what's the hard thing you dealt with and how did you deal with it, because that's the learning we all need. And that's where we build really deep connections with each other.
Yes, absolutely. And how did your family, like daughter, so Ben's older sister, how did she deal with it? What did you observe about her mental state and how she dealt with the death?
Yeah, so she grieved very differently and continues to grieve because we'll grieve his loss for the rest of our lives, and that's okay. Um, she was much more quiet. I had to be out loud, like I had to talk about it, and I ended up writing about it, and I had to let it move through me. I couldn't hold it all in. She was much more quiet, and it was really interesting for me to realize that, you know, grief is different for each person, and it's also different each time. So really, the skills that I had from other close losses, I didn't have enough for this one, right? And also, I think it's really important for us to understand that even if we're grieving the same human, we're not grieving the same person. So my grief for the loss of my son is by its nature going to be different than her grief for the loss of her brother, because our relationships are different. Our connection to him are different. And so, the three of us were really close, and the two of them were quite close. They were really good friends and, traveled together and had adventures together. And I just had to allow that she was going to grieve how she was going to grieve, and that was okay. And even though it was different than mine, I knew she loved him as much as I did, and I knew she missed him as much as I did, and I knew she was as devastated as I was. And how she did that and what she showed on the outside was hers to decide. And as a parent, that was really hard because as a parent, even though she was 25 when Ben died, she's now 28. As a parent, we still, even for our adult children, we still want to fix it, right? We want them to be happy. We want them, we want their life to be easy. Well, nothing about this was any of those things could I do. I couldn't fix it. There was nothing happy happening and nothing was easy. So it's really difficult as a parent to kind of go, okay, so my job is to support as requested and allow her to create her own path as well, the same way that I had to.
When you do have the siblings, and then when you lose a child, I heard from other parent that the siblings will go through so much of trauma and then so much of the
Mhm.
grief and loss that
Yeah.
just the parents get like more damaged and lost because they just don't know how to deal with other child who is survivor and witness the death of the siblings at young age. And I have absolutely no answer. I don't want to
Mhm.
experience. Nobody wants to experience. And then I feel like that's like double toll on you as as a mom. Like you said, you want the kids to have a easy, happy life, and clearly that's not the case. And yeah, it's just devastating.
And for me, it was a lot about giving her permission, right? I had to give her permission to do it her own way. And I think it's different with smaller kids. Like it's different when conceptually death is a hard thing for them to understand. That's an additional layer that some parents have to deal with if the kids are younger. But she was an adult, so she, it wasn't her first close loss either, right? And so, that conceptual stuff I didn't have to try and explain. It really then became a lot about how do we support each other. And she lived here, so she had moved here because of COVID. She was living across the country in Toronto, and I brought her home um, because of COVID, because I didn't want her to end up stuck there by herself. And so I brought her home. So she was, and Ben lived here too. So we were all living together. And that was a huge blessing because then we were literally there for each other. Like we could support each other. We could take turns doing whatever minimal things we could get done. We could, we had someone to talk to if we wanted to talk. We had someone to just sit and cry with. Um, so that part was really helpful. And it really, when I did my grief educator training, we talked a lot about parents who've lost a child and how high the divorce rate is. And I think that, and what we learned there was that the divorce rate is high partly because we still want the other person to be grieving like we are. So if I'm crying all the time and I'm upset and I'm angry and I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling, I want you to be having a similar experience. And if you're not, and mine seems bigger or more or something, it's really easy for us to get into a place where we start to think, well, they're not grieving and they should be. When in fact, they're just grieving their way. So it was really important for me. And, I think this applies in every situation where it's a family member, and other people are impacted by the loss as well. We need to give each other radical permission to do it our own way. And that's going to look different for each of us. Our timeline is going to be different. The way that it appears on the outside is going to be different. And we need to allow for all of that because it's unique every time.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, again, for sharing your adversity. And then I'm again very sorry about the loss
Thank
of your
you.
son.
Me too.
I feel there are so many things that as a mom myself that think of, the bullying part of it
Mhm,
or being gay, like how can we combat that? How can we do better? Like how can we support each other?
mhm,
Um, I really have no answer because as a journalist, unfortunately, I have covered some devastating stories of suicide.
mhm,
For instance, we had a guest speaker come from Vermont, Maine. Sorry, Maine or Vermont. I'm sorry. So a father who lost his son to bullying at age 13.
yeah.
And then after the fact that he committed suicide, he discovered this cyberbullying in his
Mhm,
computer.
mhm,
And he really in his book says that why didn't I do that? Like why couldn't I find out like
mhm,
what could have I done to prevent this? But then the fact is, you know, there was nothing that more he could have done. And I feel like that's the hardest part.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, especially for parents, you know, the story that we tell ourselves about being a parent is that our job is to keep our child safe. And so when we feel like we have failed at that job, and that's all story, right? There's nothing, as parents, you can't keep your child safe. That's not actually a thing you can do, really, in reality. But that's, one of our main jobs is to keep our child safe. They're supposed to be happy and healthy. And that's for so many just not the reality. And I think, for me, because Ben had struggled with poor mental wellness for a long time, I got a great deal of comfort from knowing I really had done everything. I had done everything I could to protect him. I had done everything I could to pull him away from situations that were harmful to him. We had done everything we could to find him resources, to get him care, to try meds, to try, we had done everything. And there really was nothing that we didn't do. And so I empathize and feel so much compassion for that parent who didn't understand there was a problem until it was literally too late, right? So you're finding out that all of this has been going on after your child has died. And I can only imagine the devastation that that would bring. And I absolutely know that that father did everything he could. It's the reality as parents in every given moment, and really as humans. I really do believe that in any given moment, we are doing the best we know how to do. And that has to be enough. And I think how we combat, most of these issues is education, right? Is understanding better how much we are all the same and breaking out of fear. There's so much fear as the underpinning of how our society is structured. And if we could break that up, if we could disrupt that fear and replace it with love, and we got out of our heads. In the Western culture, we're so good from the neck up. We're so good at intellectualizing and thinking things through and all that. None of that has heart. And what we desperately need right now is more people operating from their heart. Because if we were doing that, so many of the things that are happening to people would be impossible.
Yes, it's a very hard conversation, but thank you so much for truly sharing your grief and stories and the reality of it. So
Mhm.
I want to shift our conversation to the tools part. And then, Suzanne, before we move forward, I just want to thank you for not only sharing, but willing to share the tools part, because this is by far the most rewarding part of my podcast that I started. When I started in 2022, last year, January, I had no idea how many guests would come and then where they would come. And I was just hoping that as a survivor of child sex abuse and all the trauma, that I had no idea who to go to, how to navigate. I had absolutely no podcast resources growing up like this.
Mhm.
And a lot of people who had never been through the trauma, which is great, but then they would like say things like, oh, just go get a therapist, you'll be okay. It's not like that. And I feel like the tools part of it, as a survivor of any adversities that I had guests from all over the world, had been so helpful, and so much of experimental try and error and what worked, what didn't work. So I really appreciate it. So out of all these things that you've heard or tried, what are the maybe top three things that you recommend for especially a parent who unfortunately lost their child, and then going through the grief?
Okay, I love it because I had three in mind that I wanted to share, so that's perfect. So the first one really for me was this, download that I got very early days and after Ben died, and that was that to survive, I would have to be conscious and curious. So that became really my mantra and my way of just navigating the overwhelm and all of it, which is horrible. So the conscious part meant that I would allow it all and deny none of it. And that's a really hard thing to do, especially with grief, where we, even as the griever, feel so much fear. And I hear, especially from parents, it feels like who've lost a child, that they worry that if they step into all of those feelings, that they feel like they're just holding at bay, that they won't ever get out of them. And the reality is that if we turn to face them, that's when we can deal with them. And that's when we can start to move. And that's when we can start to kind of craft our new life, right? It's by feeling it all. That's the way through. So that was the first part, was just being conscious. I couldn't go on, we all as a collective love to numb things. We want to numb all those feelings out, right? With Netflix or shopping or chocolate or alcohol or whatever it is. And I knew that I couldn't do that. And that didn't mean that I never numbed, because of course you have to sometimes. But it meant that as a general approach, I wanted to stay as open to the whole experience as I could. The curiosity part was about just staying in that sense of, like, what now? What next? What now? What next? Like, and really in the early days, when you're in those very first days and you're in survival mode and you're curled up in the couch sobbing, my curiosity literally was about, how do I breathe? Like, you're in that and you're going, and you're just trying to gasp because you're sobbing so hard. It was about, like, how do I breathe? What do I know? What have I ever heard? Like, how do I breathe? Which is going to be my number two, but I want to continue down this curiosity path. What curiosity allows you to do is to stay open. Because the other thing that happens when we're facing really big adversities is we tend to close down. And I knew I needed to stay open and I needed to hold that like there was at least the possibility that what I was experiencing right now wasn't forever. And so the curiosity over time became about, why does grief work this way? Why don't we talk about it? Why don't we know how to support each other? Like the curiosity really became a lot about grief and how does it work? And is what's happening to me normal? And where do I find out? Like I had a lot of curiosity as I realized I had to kind of chart my own path and figure out my own way. So that curiosity has expanded over time, and it was a way that I chose to live my life before Ben died. I really was aware that I wanted to live with this sense of growth, that that was what I was on the planet to do, was to just, get better at being a good human and get better at loving each other. And, that was kind of my approach before. And I knew that needed to be a mantra, or I would want to shut down and constrict. And we want to be as expansive as possible, right? That's the way to healing, is through expanding, not through constriction. So that was the first kind of download that I had. And then I was so grateful that I had some amazing tools in my toolbox. Many of them from people like Brene Brown, if you're aware of her work around shame and vulnerability and emotions. She's brilliant at that. I've read all of her things, watched all of her, like I follow her very closely, learned so much from her. Another one is Dr. Gabor Mate, who's doing, I discovered him way back in the day when he was doing work around children and parenting. And now he's doing stunning work about trauma. And when I listen to him talk, I just think, oh my gosh, I wish they'd had this 5 years ago, because this, these ideas and the learning, the way we know now how trauma impacts us could have healed Ben, right? But we didn't know how to do that then. The tool that I used the most in those early days is from a brilliant book called Burnout. And it's by two sisters whose names I can never remember, because that's part of what grief does to your brain. It's all foggy. But the book is called Burnout. You can find it everywhere. And they actually had an exercise for what to do when you're crying and you want to stop crying, that helps you to complete the stress cycle, right? Because we also know that we don't want to hold stress in our body. We don't want to hold the trauma in our body. We need to complete those stress cycles to remain physically healthy and mentally healthy as well. So I use that exercise all the time, and I'm happy to share it. It's in the book Burnout by, I know one of the sisters is Emily, don't know the name of the other one. And their exercise is so brilliant because it's a mind exercise, but it's also a physical exercise. So when you're crying, you know how when you get really upset about something and you're crying really hard, your brain continues down a certain path, right? Ben is dead. I can't believe he's dead. And then you have this whole path that you go down about how your life will never be the same. And now everything is destroyed. And, he's not going to be at his sister's wedding when it happens one day. And he was supposed to be here when I was old and take care of me. And like you go down this whole path. And then you continue to cry because you're telling yourself all those stories. What they suggest, which I found so helpful and brilliant, is as you're crying, you shift your thinking to what's happening to you physically. So this is also brilliant because it deals with what's happening in your body. So instead of continuing down that path of thinking about all the things that are wrong, you shift your thinking to what's happening in your body. So what is my face doing? Oh, my eyes are all squinched up and my jaw is so tight. And where else do I feel it in my body? Oh, my shoulders are shaking. Oh, I feel sick to my stomach. Oh, like my leg is in a cramp, whatever it is. So you shift your attention away from your stinking thinking and shift it to what's happening physically. And that completes the stress cycle. And it also brings you into your body, right? Which is where we hold that stress and that trauma. And we don't want to, because then it becomes malignant. So that was a great exercise that I used a lot. And I shared with other people who were like, I just can't stop crying. And I'd be like, okay, you have to try this weird thing, but it really works. The other one was a brilliant exercise that I had learned and continue to use from my mentor, Dr. Claire Zammit. So she is the founder of the Institute for Women-Centered Coaching, Training, and Leadership, and she created a system called Feminine Power. And she has a brilliant exercise about feelings, because part of what happens for us in grief is we are bombarded with a lot of feelings. And if we don't have really good language or really good, emotional intelligence and agility, that's easily overwhelming. And she has a brilliant exercise about connecting with those feelings. So you basically are just having a conversation with yourself. You don't have to share it out loud. You don't have to feel put on the spot. It's just a conversation with you. And you ask yourself 3 times, how do you feel? And then all you do is reflect back what the answer is. So I would say something like, Suzanne, how do you feel? And right now I would say, I feel so grateful. And so you respond to yourself, oh, I hear that you feel grateful. And then you ask again. And what that 3 times allows you to do is that you get into more nuanced language. Because we all love to live on the sort of the sad, mad, glad trifecta of languaging our emotions, which of course are much more complex than that. So doing it 3 times helps you to get to what's really underneath. Because a lot of times we start out with, I feel angry. And angry isn't really the emotion usually. Usually there's something else underneath, disappointment or frustration or something is usually under the anger. And that's what's on the surface. So it helps you get down deeper into what's really going on. And then the fourth question is, what do you need? So it helps us to really connect our needs and our feelings and our sense that we can care for ourselves, right? That we can feel self compassion, we can feel self love, and that we can feel really resourced even in those most difficult times when we feel like our life has blown up and is spinning outside of our control. So it's another way we really get connected to ourselves because that's the first key, right? It's that old, back to that old, I don't know when they started saying it, but that whole idea where, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first. You have to take care of yourself. And especially in grief, where many of the people around you won't be able to show up to support you. You have to practice this, real self compassion, real self care, and self love, and self permission to find your own way and figure it out and ignore the people that are giving you terrible advice, right? And just kind of work your way through it. So that would be the 3 things: conscious and curious, complete that stress cycle, get in connection with your emotions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I wrote Burn Out, the book, on a comment. One thing I really want to share as a survivor of trauma and the part that hyperventilating and crying and I can't
Yeah.
breathe, it feels like forever. But one of the thing I read one time was it comes and goes and it's like contraction. It's almost like labor.
Mhm.
Um, it's not forever. However you feel, it's like forever,
Yeah.
ever.
Yes. And it's really not. The reality is that it's not. But when you're in that experience, it's all encompassing. And if you don't have anything in your toolbox, first of all, to understand that it's not going to be forever, and second of all, to be able to disrupt the stories you're telling yourself that kind of keep you in, they almost keep you like re-traumatizing yourself. Like if you don't have any way to disrupt that, then it even more feels like it's forever and you can't, break out of it.
And I like what you said, the curiosity and facing all these emotions rather than
Yeah.
turning yourself away. So in my book, my um, prologue, um, sorry, epilogue at the end, um, basically it talks about a friend of mine told me about the lion story where the strategy of the lion how they hunt is they put the older like male lion and then all these animals come and then they
Mhm.
roar when he roars because of his look and one lion is scary it's scary so they turn to the bush to get away from that one lion. However, when they turn to the bush to run away from the fear, there are a bunch of lions waiting in the bush and then they
Mm,
eaten. And the lesson here is you have to go towards the fear because if you
yeah,
don't, you're gonna have worse consequences in the end. And that's the lesson my friend was telling me about when I was crying. And then the basically almost like you don't want to face it. You don't want to face
yeah,
the fear. And
yeah,
I like what I can relate to what you say about, this rabbit hole of down spiral of thinking about the thoughts pattern of the worst and the worst and then what ifs and all the things that you
yeah,
can out of it. And I like what you say about asking yourself. giving yourself permission, giving yourself action, mask yourself, and then really checking in with yourself. And that those are the intelligence and information that I've never had growing up.
Yes. Yeah. Like, why aren't we learning that in school, right? Why are we still memorizing things that we all carry a computer in our pocket? Let's learn more of that. How do we self-regulate? How do we take care of ourselves? And I know there's a movement to teaching all of that, but yeah, so many of us don't learn that in our childhoods. And I do believe that's changing with my kids' generation. There was a real shift, and there's a real shift among them and how they talk about things that are going on for them with their friends, but it's not enough of a part of our collective yet. And so we need to keep pushing. We need to keep talking about it.
I absolutely agree with you. Somebody asked me, what does survive mean? And I said,
Mm,
survive means to be equipped with logics and languages that can
yeah.
eloquently combat the negativity comes internally and externally. And that was my answer to him. And I feel like the eloquency of building up the emotional intelligence and combating this mental health and all these things that we were shying away. And I don't know
Mhm.
how it started the stigma and how we can normalize these conversations and destigmatize this mental health talks, and even like an LGBTQ, racism, bullying, anything that is on our way. And I feel that more conversation has to be there. However, it's not there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, it's about getting to that wherever the tipping point is, right? And for me, what I see happening right now is there's so much fear and there's so much suppressed emotion that's what we're seeing lashing out, right? That's why we're seeing so much hate being lashed about and so much, oh, it's just there's so much, poison happening right now. And unfortunately, with our negativity bias that we all have, that's what gets the news. That's what gets the attention. That's what we're talking about. What if instead we talked about this beautiful podcast that Juri has, where she has people come on and talk about adversities they faced and what tools they had, so we can all learn about that? Because there is a movement, right? You're part of, where we're saying enough. It's enough. We cannot continue down this path. We have to shift gears. And the way we're going to do it is by sharing our stories. That's how we're going to do it.
Yes. So thank you again. And then my last question to you is a gift that came from the adversity. So Suzanne, what would you say a gift that came from your adversity?
So it's so hard to conceptualize it that way because I want to be very clear that I would give up any gift to have Ben back. So that's a given. And, when something terrible happens to us, we get to make choices. And so the choices I made were around things like really wanting to be sure that even though he was gone, that I still had as big and rich and interesting and adventuresome a life as I would have if he was here. So it's been really interesting to get to focus on that and have that be like part of my planning, the DNA of my planning is, how do I continue to have this big life? How do I stay expansive? And the awareness of that as a purposeful choice, as a purposeful part of my choice making has been a real gift. One of the best gifts out of it has been to get to know his friends. So when he was alive, he kept his friends and I all siloed. So I didn't know his friends, and he had two groups of friends that didn't know each other. And in talking to other people who've had mental health challenges, I've learned that that's actually really normal, because if you have issues with anxiety and bullying, right? Anxiety and depression that come out of bullying, especially if all of your friends know each other and they all get mad at you or they all decide there's something wrong with you, then you have nobody. So if you keep them separate from each other and separate from me, then if one of them is upset with you or one of them thinks you're terrible or whatever, you still have the others. So I have had a real blessing of getting to know his friends, and I'm still in contact with most of them. Um, with many of them, and I see, two of his best friends, I see them regularly and we get together. So that's been a real gift. Um, being able to talk to people and really realizing that, speaking publicly is easy for me. It's not hard for me at all. Writing is not that hard for me. And when I started to write and share what was happening with me on Facebook to friends and family, the response I got was so validating, so encouraging, because it was helping people open up conversations. It was helping people see grief a different way. And so to me, that's part of how I honor Ben. And I honor that, this terrible thing happened to him, happened in my life, and I'm not going to let it be for nothing. So, how do I build a life where, yes, that is a traumatic thing that happened to me? I will never forget it. I will never forget him. I'm building a life that he's part of. I'm moving forward with him. We have rituals and things we do to remember him regularly. And I remember him every second of every day anyway, because he's my child. And so, how do I use what happened to me, as you're doing, to push this along, to shift these paradigms of fear, to help us feel more love? Ben was deeply loved and deeply respected and deeply, embraced by a lot of people. And so, how do I continue, the gift of love that he's not here to give anymore? How do I make sure that I'm giving enough, that I'm giving for both of us?
Well, thank you very much for coming again to the podcast, A Gift from Adversity. I truly appreciate you. And I hope our conversation how somehow help other people who might be listening or will be listening. And I really appreciate you sharing your story today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for opening up this important space. I just think what you're doing is brilliant.
Thank you. That means a lot. Well, thank you again for our audience. And I have more guests coming in from all over the world. And then I appreciate you tuning in. So we'll see you next time.